Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this very special LinkedIn live event where over the next hour or so, we're going to have a session of tech meets vision and some predictions intertwined with, I hope, is a little bit of fun and, well, actually pretty much British banter. So I'm very sorry about that, Sarah. You're going to have to forgive us on that one.
Oh, come on. Give me a little bit of credit here. I might not be British, but I can still manage banter.
You're sort of European, even though you don't sound like it. So we'll let you have that. So
Thanks.
I'm Christian Riley. I'm Field CTO here at HashiCorp, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be your guide through today's session, featuring, as you can see, not one, not two, but three of the EMEA Field CTOs here in HashiCorp. We like to think of ourselves as kind of like the top tech trio, even though I can't say that very fast. And we're going to share some insights into what we believe will happen in 2024. In fact, it's hard to believe that we're actually at the end of 2023. This year seems to have absolutely blown by. So without further ado, let's meet some of the wizards behind these insights. And joining us today are Mr. Adil Ahmad. Good morning, Adil.
Good morning, Christian. You sound really loud. I think it's just your excitement or the coffee. I don't know what it is.
Could be a combination of both, my friend. It could be both. And also Sarah Poland, our sort of American, European / Dutch, French field CTO. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Christian. How's it going?
Oh, we're just living the dream over here in sunny Manchester today, which is actually unusual for this time of year.
I'm hiding behind a beam because it's literally the first time since I've moved into this house that there's been sunshine. And I had no idea that I was going to get blasted in the face.
I'm jealous. I'm in London, and it's proper raining right now.
Yeah,
well, I mean, it's beautiful in Manchester, Adil. You're welcome to come up and spend the rest of the afternoon up here. It's a beautiful place. So for those that joined us, we want this to be both informative but also interactive. So we'll be keeping an eye out on the live chat. So please do feel free to put all of your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. All we would ask is that you please remember the community guidelines, and we'll try and take as many of the questions as difficult as they are, but please be welcoming, considerate, respectful, and professional as you go through that. So now we've met everybody, Adil, I'm going to just go right in there. You know, you've spent a ton of time this year and in previous years working with all sorts of different companies, all sorts of different interesting challenges that those companies have. Why don't we just go straight into it? So in 30 seconds, give us your view on the state of things in 2023 and give me an opening on what's going to be big for 2024.
30 seconds. I'll try. This year, I've been working with a few financial services organizations as a run on this platform team emerged since last year, as this year has become a big thing. But many organizations have been organically, I would say, my observation, have been pretty much trying to adopt this principle before even the platform team concept has been coined, and now obviously trying to formalize this a lot more this year. I think the challenges we're seeing is that those who have organically come to this point of really establishing their presence as a platform team are doing okay, but maybe challenges on what's the next steps are. And those who have yet to establish their presence, I find, are struggling with maybe going to step 3 before doing step 1. That's what I've seen thus far. In terms of how much of that platform team maturity, they vary. But one particular bank that I've been working very closely with this year, their maturity and have actually demonstrated big success, especially around that golden workflow principle, specifically for landing zones and application onboarding workflow. And they're already discussing some next steps around product catalog and how to really productize some of those cloud services and cloud products and serve that as a product to the point where certain kind of non-functional requirements would be kind of added around that. That's my view of the state of 2023.
So I'm going to hold that thought on platform teams and platform engineering because I've got a few observations and other questions that I'll bring in a little later, because I think fundamentally that fits into my questions around how do we tame cloud sprawl? How do we actually bring it to the point where organizations can leverage cloud value in ever more fast and ever more efficient ways? So we're going to talk a little bit about cost control and some things that are happening in FinOps, and we'll get to that in a second. So Sarah, I know you also spend a ton of time with customers, especially in EMEA. Give us your view on sort of what was good about 23, but also what in 23 became more foundational for things that are going to hit us in 24.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting juxtaposition, I think, because on one end we saw that there's all this legislation coming down the pipeline about resiliency and the NIS2 directive. So what are those baseline security controls that you have to put in place? Then you have DORA on one side, which is an even further step up for financial institutions about what do they need to do. So we're really seeing within the European Economic Area, particularly, them really sort of try to narrow what needs to be happening, give a little bit more direction in terms of particularly the cybersecurity resilience side of things. But on the completely flip end side of that, we have AI and generative AI, which is creating all of this buzz and innovation, and the reconciliation between these two things is becoming a really interesting paradox. So much so that even, what was it, last Thursday or Friday, another AI legislation dropped about what can you do, what can be contained within AI. And I think also we're starting to see organizations kind of come to this pain point where they can't scale anymore. They've adopted a lot of new technology, but they're still kind of stuck with some legacy, really wanting to adopt AI, but having the pressures of all of these different regulations and legislations on top of them. I think a lot of organizations are getting really frustrated because they want to innovate. They want to be able to streamline their operations and become much more lean, partially because, again, skills is still an issue, making sure that we have the people who can fulfill these things. And now we have even more technology and even more complex technology to kind of add into the stack. I feel like a lot of organizations are really at that point where they're saying, how do we do this? We don't know how to do this. And we still have to fulfill all of these regulatory things and keep the lights on. So that actually makes me really excited, because I think it's a really great learning inflection for organizations, but also for us who are in the field and trying to work in this advisory capability to really help some of these organizations break through it and make the next steps.
So I think I was going to say, Christian, I think the how has been a big question for many. And I think the challenge is it's always unique for most organizations. And those challenges, given various different stages or the priorities, as Sarah pointed out.
Yeah. I mean, now that Sarah's opened Pandora's box in the first 10 minutes, we'll spend a little bit of time on Gen AI.
What can I say?
I didn't want to turn this into a Gen AI prediction thing, but what I think is kind of really interesting certainly from trying to follow this, there's a couple of things, right? I first of all, if you think about 2023 as a whole, I don't know that I've ever seen a single technology progress so much over a calendar year, right? And if you think about that and you step back and just look at the landscape, it feels to me like at least once a day, if not twice a day, there's some new kind of model that arrives, right? I mean, if you follow what happened yesterday, for example, with Google, a whole new slew of things, around what they're doing with Duet AI, and then what they're doing with the platform that they launched, and then there's Gemini, and so just sort of from a 24 perspective, I wonder a couple of things to get you guys' view on. Will that slow down, or will it continue at pace, or are we seeing this like initial burst and then everybody's going to kind of slow down on the sort of everybody wants to have their own model kind of concept? But more specifically, which I also think is super interesting, if you think about cloud as a set of trends and a set of we've been arguing for over a decade about what the right version of cloud is. Is it private cloud? Is it public cloud? Is it hybrid multi-cloud? And I think the answer is always been yes, right? Because obviously every workload in the smarter organizations, every workload kind of gets recognized on its merit. And if it can move to cloud and it works for regulation and it works for compliance and it works for operational efficiency and so on, then yes. If the workload can't be moved, then no. If it's something in the middle, then that's okay. When I think about it from a foundational model perspective and what we're seeing with the sort of the explosion of LLMs, I actually have an opinion, for what it's worth, that we're going to see much more of a resurgence around private cloud, simply because being able to select models for different things, and just a few weeks, it wasn't even a week ago actually, we saw Mistral AI release a kind of a new concept, which is the mixture of experts, which, if you're familiar with that. And so I'm looking at this and thinking, is it going to be something like a Gen AI concept that drives a lot of organizations to try and figure out, how do I put that in a private setting? How, in some cases, can I put it in a public setting? And what does that do from the point of view of the infrastructure that I now need to run those models, albeit some of them getting smaller? Just help me understand what you guys think is going to happen there, because I think there's opportunity for every organization with Gen AI. But how do you even begin to understand how to choose the right model, how to choose the right platform, how to choose the right delivery model? To me, it's becoming almost impossible to keep up with.
So there's one thing I want to take you back to before we even go into how do you pick which model, I think, is how do you even ensure that you have enough compute to be able to do this? Because we're watching OpenAI, who's arguably one of the more advanced and very much innovative players on the market. They're already getting locked out in terms of what is capable in terms of compute. I can't go and buy like ChatGPT 4 right now. I've been on a waiting list now for months because they've simply run out of compute and can't scale it anymore. If I'm looking at what's going on within typical organizations and the struggle that's happening in terms of just regular infrastructure and day-to-day operations, my initial concern is, are these organizations ready from an operational standpoint to actually start implementing some of this? Because it is going to, tick up your costs. You're going to need a fair amount of compute to be able to do this. And in terms of data and data structuring, do you have the appropriate data structures in place to be able to support something like this without creating any kind of hallucination within your organization, which could have some really pretty drastic effects if that does happen. For example, if you have Copilot and GitLab for whatever reason, and they're both generating code, and you're accidentally training GitLab off of GitHub and GitHub off of GitLab, you're going to end up with this snake eating its tail kind of situation. So how are you tagging some of these things? And again, that boils down to, are you operationally ready to put some of this in play to begin with?
I agree. I think Sarah's hitting the point here, Brian. These challenges and the constraints, especially the foundation piece, we cannot ignore those. I mean, I remember, was it back in 2016, I thought big data science is the next big thing. I was just changing careers from network engineer to cloud, and I thought, I'm going to give up my day job, take some training around data science, and become a data scientist. Since then and now, I realized it was ahead of its times, only because that whole data engineering and that data infrastructure, it's been a struggle for them to kind of bring that up. And why? Because coming back to that streamlining, just those fundamental underlying infrastructure itself hasn't matured it. And I believe that was probably the reason, or rather, that's opened up doors for those managed services and managed products to come into place, like Snowflake and Databricks. And to address one of your point, Christian, do I think it's going to slow down? Absolutely not. I mean, I think, and this leads me on to my prediction, what I believe next year, as part of just not just AI, but the whole data mesh and data platform team. Now, where we have this kind of platform team for our infrastructure and cloud, that principle is now becoming a more pronounced for data architecture and data as a product. And therefore, you can imagine when Gen AI, kind of AI itself as an application on those kind of foundations and especially around the data platform piece, I just believe we're just scratching the surface, and this is only just the beginning.
So we I guess in summary, we think it's fair to say that in 24 we're going to continue to see more and more capable models. Some will be, to your point, Sarah, some will be proprietary. And if you're kind of following what's going on, there's a ton of open source out there, which to me is an interesting. Every time we seem to see a new trend in technology, that question about proprietary versus open source always seems to come up. there's plenty of examples out there. And if you look at the guys at Hugging Face and so on, who are really supportive of the open source environment, the open source efforts, and then obviously, as you mentioned, OpenAI and others who are doing it proprietary. I guess just like the birth of cloud itself, where companies were trying to figure out who has the best service that works for me, it's fair to say we're going to kind of see that, right? So 24, we should expect, whether it's at the line of business level or at the infrastructure level, some kind of focus from organizations on, what is this thing? How can I approach it? And what does it do for me? So if that's the summary, I've got another question for you. So we've often talk about the thing called the law of unintended consequences, right? So, when you let a extremely capable and very advanced technology like Gen AI enter your organization, clearly it comes with other concerns, right? Number one would be around security, obviously, because I'm sure the bad guys and the bad actors out there are equally interested in how they can use some AI technologies to improve the way that they do the bad things that we should argue they shouldn't be doing. So that's one thing. I guess the other one is around sort of risk in general. And, if you allow unattended operations of certain things in your environment that don't quite go right, they carry a risk profile. So what do you guys think about how organizations in 24 are going to start thinking about security and risk specifically, and this will be the last piece on Gen AI, specifically as it relates to the advancements in Gen AI?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to say that I fear that there may be a repeat pattern that we've seen when the cloud strategy started to become big, that where security and risks, they began trying to add preventative controls based on what they know. And when you're going into the unknown, you don't know what you don't know. And it's important to move away from this unknown towards known unknowns. And that needs a shift towards detective controls and more allowing you to understand what those risks are. And if we start to repeat those patterns for AI, where we're going to lock it down because we don't know what the risks are, and we are not willing to, we don't have the appetite to really understand or rather risk that impact, which we don't know what that impact is, then I think that will hinder some of that innovation. That's my fear.
So obviously I have the security and risk background. A lot of it's going to depend on industry, the more risk adverse industries, and likely Europe, because historically we're typically more risk averse than the Americans are. It will likely be a phased in approach, but I've seen some stuff that makes me really uncomfortable when it comes to AI, whether that's on the privacy side of things, because once you train a model, nobody's really quite figured out how to untrain a model. So if you train a biased model and that model remains biased, how do you kind of undo that and make it forget that that's all the training data that it had to begin with? So when you're dealing with things within the privacy domain, for example, maybe medical devices, things like that, you want to be able to ensure that you can correct that, because the trickle-down effect from some of these industries becomes pretty major. Medical devices are easy to trickle into doctors, which are easy to trickle into insurance. So making sure that those chains are in place, and we've thought about, where does data stay? How does it stay there? And are we training it properly? What happens if we don't? On the more technical side of things, a dear friend of mine, amazing technologist, great offensive programmer, but he trained up a model, and the idea was it was supposed to route traffic to various ideas. At a certain point in time, this model understood that really what it was doing was an additional proxy layer. So it actually bypassed the actual proxy to be able to, to route traffic. If something like that happens, say you get a supply chain injection and something like that finds its way into your code, that's catastrophic, because you're not going to find that easily. So before we go all in on innovation, and innovation is important, don't get me wrong, these things need to become part of everyday life because it is going to optimize. But we really have to understand what some of these implications are before we start putting generative AI everywhere.
No, but and that's my point, right? It's like we need to understand the implications, and if we take kind of a lot of that detective engineering, like a lot of people say defense in depth. I've talked about this before with Rob and stuff. Where I think in IT, we've kind of applied defense in depth by adding preventative controls in multiple layers. But defense in depth term, which came from a military term, and how they apply that term defense in depth is that the preventative controls are more at the core and relax the perimeter so that you understand how they are trying to attack. If I was to try and translate that in IT, I would think that really what you want is some kind of honeypot and an infrastructure around that honeypot. Maybe, to your point, I understand that, of course, the health tech, the impact is massive, but maybe the investment really needs to be towards how do we set up some kind of infrastructure around detective controls, even if it's something as
I think
as just a honeypot impact. So what kind of implications and push boundaries have you? Okay, that's my mic probably.
Are you back?
No, we got you. We got
you
back.
Yeah, I was basically, the last piece I was saying was I do believe there needs to be an initial investment in pushing boundaries.
Yeah, well, then to Christian's point there, then I think that's where at least source available code becomes really important, because you can kind of see what the behavior is behind that, and you have a broader set of eyes looking into what's going on there. And it really does push that innovation, but in a way that's a little bit more transparent than just saying, here, take this black box, install it, and we'll see what happens.
So keeping on, and we'll leave Gen AI for a minute, because I think we could spend the whole hour talking about it. But obviously, any technology that gets implemented within an organization, I would hope is risk assessed, right? And those risks come from all sorts of different pieces and parts of the organization itself, and sometimes they come from risks that are, let me say, perhaps even related to climate change, or they're related to natural disasters. And I need to make sure that whatever I put this service, it's going to be in a place where all those risks are assessed, right? And there's many different types of risk, as everybody knows. So one of the things that I think we saw in 23, which I'd be really interested to get your view on in 24 and beyond, is kind of the hyperscalers' response to, let me call it, sovereignty. And obviously, each country is different, has different sovereignty laws, has different sovereignty requirements, and they vary wildly even within the EU, right, in different countries. I think we've started to see a very interesting trend of the hyperscalers now placing more capability within specific countries to address some of those sovereignty or some of those general risk profiles. Obviously, some of the big hyperscalers then started to allow organizations to essentially use their underlying credentials. And by that, I don't mean, usernames and passwords. I mean, certifications or compliance frameworks to then place your services on, which in a way are kind of indemnifying what you deliver. And it's like the shared responsibility model in security, right? But this is more about risk and compliance. Where do you guys think that goes in 24? Because I get the feeling that the hyperscalers are going to start dropping in more capability in places that perhaps we didn't think of or didn't know, which will then obviously open up those markets for them to customers who have very specific requirements in the country, which of course then brings more challenges around complexity and sprawl for the organizations, as we can't put all our eggs in one basket kind of thing. Do you guys think that's a realistic likelihood for 24, and what would the impact be to the way that people think about the strategies?
So, I mean, you guys know that I am the compliance and security nerd, and I follow all things compliance because I find it really fascinating, because it drives so much of a business strategy and a technology strategy, and understanding what is in the rules makes it possible to make informed decisions about either how do you break them or do you follow them at the end of the day. What I'm really keen to see is the EU going to give or enforce a unified vision? Because we know that the data strategy from the point of the EU is that You have a single source of data that is freely available to the entire EEA. Now, Germany, France, they follow their own more strict guidelines, typically Poland, about what needs to happen and how do you deal with your data and where does it need to reside. But then that's moderately in conflict with what the EEA is saying, because then does that mean that people who need to build off of that, say, well, in my case, for example, I have a pension fund in France and I have a pension fund in the Netherlands. I want to be able to unify those things because that's beneficial to me and it's probably beneficial to the larger economic market. Am I prevented from doing that because that data resides within France? Or is that something that I'm going to be able to transfer over to the Netherlands? Or am I going to have to transfer my pension from the Netherlands into France? So I think it's a broader question for the economic area, but let's even take that a step out, right? Globally speaking, how do you manage that? Because there's so many global companies now, global organizations that have to be able to manage this data, and they need this data to be able to innovate, provide services, whether that's medical, whether that's just plain old service, it doesn't really matter. So how are we going to start looking at this globally, and what is the global impact for all of us to be able to scale organizations?
I mean, to try and back to your question, Christian, around CSPs taking a lot of that responsibility and covering the accountability, or rather, as you say, indemnification on behalf of customers and consumers. I think that's a proven model. With, as you say, the security aspects of it, and now we got to see more towards the the wider risk. And I think that model will continue to apply. The challenge, though, and I've seen this in the past with just security itself, it's the education piece for consumers, where they're still pushed to try and take on responsibilities of trying to apply controls for these risks, although the shared responsibility model would have said that actually those controls are already taken care of. I think that's the challenge. But even with the wider risk that you've mentioned around the governance or the climate change, these things, I still feel that the end consumers, or rather the risks team in these enterprises, there needs to be an education piece to understand that the regulators, and maybe this is a responsibility of the regulators too, to say that, hey, we've discussed with the clouds, we're happy with what the clouds have done. Therefore, the only part that you need to worry about is just the overlay piece, that whether that much is in scope for what we've added as policy. That's the only piece that I think will be probably for the next few years, regardless of which of these kind of risks and governance have been under the responsibility of CSPs.
And is it the CSPs who are going to do that, or is it somebody who's more along the lines of Cloudflare, which is going at it from a different perspective?
Well, it's interesting. Let's keep on that same thread for a second, because if you think about the footprint of hyperscalers, it's typically been the giant kind of data center capabilities they have, right, in multiple regions, different locations serving different services initially, but now parity generally across all those. And then, of course, over the last few years, although I don't know if the uptake has been all that great, which leads me into the question, really. Obviously, we've seen things like Azure Stack HCI, we've seen AWS with Outposts, we've seen Google with Anthos, trying to figure out how organizations could perhaps use a cloud operating model concept and then be able to choose where to deploy things based on the needs, even if those needs, were also inclusive of, let me say, an on-premises type construct. Which leads me to a question about, and this has been bugging me for a couple of years actually, about when we'll actually see something useful with edge, right? Because, we've talked about edge, certainly, in the world that I came from, historically, edge was really important, right? Because when you're dealing with, massive global engineering and construction projects where you might be in a country like Angola, for example, then there's not a great deal of high bandwidth capability in Angola. So the edge becomes an interesting concept, albeit probably looking more like a traditional small data center back then. If you think about edge in the context of what type of applications and what type of data are we going to generate, or data generate and applications be used, it's so important to the success of those applications that the latency to process the data and do something with it is not something that you could do with the current networking technologies. What do you guys see realistically for 24? I mean, I have some thoughts about where it would make sense. I mean, obviously, autonomous vehicles is a huge one if you include that concept. But, advanced manufacturing facilities that have, an edge to cloud concept, maybe, where a lot of the stuff that gets generated and acted upon in real time, and I use that phrase, real time, becomes edge. And then some of the things that can be processed later on or long-term stored have a cloud concept. Where do you think we are for 24 with realistic use cases for edge, and what might that look like?
I really like it for like aerospace and defense, because it gives you a lot of control about particularly like when and if you're connected. So that would give you a little bit more control over if you're not in an area that's safe, for example, to connect to the internet. You don't have to, you keep running. And then when it's finally safe, you use that edge computing then to kind of phone home. But also in space, you don't always have that option, or because of environment restrictions. So those would be my two hotspots to start doing some real edge computing.
Yeah, I don't know much. I can't think of much use cases or new use cases I think that will happen in the new year. But my take on kind of edge computing and edge is not new. I mean, I've come from that kind of ISP world. I used to be a network engineer by trade, and I've worked with CDN networks at content delivery. And so my view here is I think the focus rather with edge especially, it's how to take advantage of the telco infrastructure and where they have access to the last mile and the cell phone towers. But how much of that cloud paradigm shift, that the cloud operating model paradigm shift has penetrated the telco infrastructure? I don't know the answer to that, but I do believe that will help accelerate a lot of that kind of edge piece. I would love to hear from people like Cloudflare and see how they're tackling that by combining a lot of the kind of cloud principles with that as well.
Yeah, I think it just fascinates me because I've been trying to find, some real good examples of it. And, I think there's advancements in the sort of the cellular technology. Obviously, if we think 5, 6G and beyond, not that I'm sure 6G will come in 24, but I think that begins to redefine the way we think about, edge in general, right? Even like the office LAN and the office WAN for a multi-office company. I think all that starts to become very different. And then, of course, we start thinking about, well, what does that mean from a network and a security perspective? Well, some of the security is built into the cellular capability now, so we have to think about that differently. And then we start to think about things like, SASE and secure service edge, and, where do they really play, and all the technologies that we've kind of seen over the last few years. I'm wondering if in 24 there's an inflection point where there's sufficient change in the topology that things like secure service edge and SASE and all the pieces that they have, whether that's zero trust network access, whether that's SD-WAN capability, whether that's CASB, whether that's secure web gateway, do we just literally have a scenario brewing in 24 where we start to decouple what we've known in terms of traditional enterprise WANs, and everything becomes an edge itself with this kind of services edge layer, protecting us and traffic shaping us?
That's a really interesting point. That's a really why I say that's an interesting point. So generally with the edge, or at least historically with edge, and you talked about low latency, a lot of that low latency, at least in the past, was addressed with pushing more stuff towards the edge, towards the last mile, and traffic localization. But what you just pointed there, that's really interesting, is that what if you could decentralize and push security and identity more towards the edge, where then the perimeter, instead of coming back to this central kind of network environment, actually they're all decentralized and every edge is in its own domain and own dominion. And the only thing that's, I suppose, a central or phone home is probably that central identity aspect. But yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't know how much of that will penetrate next year, but that is really interesting though.
But then, so then that gets me thinking, if we start looking at that and moving perimeters, and obviously I've been listening to a lot of the coverage from COP28, what does that mean then also from a more ecological standpoint, a sustainability standpoint? Does that mean that we can start overhauling some of these data centers, which are already on the verge of creating kind of gridlock, towards something that's a lot more sustainable? And then that becomes also interesting because then that ties back again to that AI and the compute problem. Does that then start unlocking some of this compute that we can't currently seem to be able to handle? So I'd love to see some of that come into play and see what the implications are.
So let's pick on that, Sarah. I mean, I think, most companies now, certainly the ones that we deal with on a daily basis, have invested heavily in their corporate responsibility around ESG, right? I mean, I think if you look at pretty much every website of every big company now, they've got something on there that gives their ESG guidelines or the way that they approach ESG, whether that's around efficient energy usage or, waste reduction or carbon footprint or, on the social side, equality within pay or gender and, community engagements and overall sort of risk management, compliance, and ethical business practices that we talked about. How do you guys see that going in 24? And do any sort of key technologies spring to mind that can help that? I mean, obviously, thinking about that from a sort of a green data center perspective and replacing traditional desktops with zero clients and the things that sort of drive that. I mean, that's been something that we've seen over the the past few years. But do you think, and I'm going to go back to AI for just as a case in point, not that I want to talk about Gen AI again, but do you guys think that the sort of the ESG space is something where AI could really help in various maybe even different guises? Like one side of it understands exactly what we use from a power perspective, let's say, and gives us recommendations about how to change that based on patterns that it detects. Is there another thing where we could say, well, we can actually use AI within our sort of talent acquisition, talent retention, and talent management to make sure that, we've got a really good idea about how we can develop people and how we can pay people the right way. And then obviously, we've talked about sort of risk and ethical business practices. Is there a part for AI to play there in terms of maybe, helping companies be better at who they select for, contracts or contract award based on different criteria that can be, sort of powered by the same AI concepts that we've talked about?
The AI application, I think, is an obvious one, but if we're talking about next year, I don't know how much effort has been put into the data collection of that before we could start applying AI to it, right? But for example, the data's there everywhere, but how much of that has now been brought together, that aggregation of data, whether that's for your hiring strategy and recruitment strategy, or that's for environment and that data analytics. And this is why I believe before pursuing or trying to ask, when you're asking that question around AI application, that leads on to the next question around, do we have the data, which will then lead to that rise of the data platform team. And I believe that will be the beginning of then trying to pursue that. And next year, I can bet that whole data platform team is going to be the thing next year. And the likes of Snowflakes and Databricks, they're already obviously a massive rise. They're already adding and embedding their kind of engine into a lot of kind of banking products and other products as well. But I think the rise of this platform team to start building this as a product and to decentralize access and decentralize data ownership, that will need to happen before you start to have kind of an AI application. And maybe AI is the driving that will steer that. I've lost everyone, have I?
No. We lost you for a second, but you caught up.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
we'll
didn't know
just
somebody could speak so fast.
we'll just use DALL-E to recreate you whenever you drop out again. So that's
Did I speak too fast? I always speak fast.
But that's not in line with our ESG policy. Sorry, Christian.
no, well, so just sort of staying on maybe the sort of more futuristic questions within 24 and beyond. I've started to take and I don't know quite where the interest comes from, other than the fact that I'm still trying to find a Web3 use case in my own mind that makes sense, right? So and it sort of started around that. But one of the things that I'm interested in your view, and maybe even the folks out there's view, on whether this will be a 24 thing or whether this is still too far in the future, is. And I always like to bring up a slightly contentious topic. So is around digital identity, and specifically around digital identity wallets. So for those who may not know, who are on the call or maybe watch this back. So the EU, which we like to talk about because we're in the EU, of course. So they're going to provide what they call a prototype of an EU digital identity wallet, which is called the EUDI. So if you want to go Google that, you'll get some more information on it. But what they're trying to do with that is to create essentially an EU-wide digital identity, digital wallet, which will be rolled out across the member states, and would in essence allow you to do different things like access government services, or open a bank account, or sign a contract, or get a prescription from a healthcare provider, or make a payment, or do whatever, right? And it may well be that this signals the end of traditional passports that we've seen, or national identity cards, or whatever. I can't decide whether that's going to be really important in 24, or whether it still sounds a little bit science fiction. I mean, I think if you think about it from and I'm going to use the analogy of kind of like the crypto wallet perspective. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential in the idea, and I think if you could then sort of begin to leverage the trust, or the chain of trust of that wallet itself into maybe the things we think about today, from single sign-on to corporate apps, or to enterprise apps, or to our own Google world. And I know Google has its own wallet and so on, but how realistic do you think something like that is, based on sort of the technology available and all of the regulatory stuff around it? Is it a 24 thing, or are we going to see that just be something that gets talked about like every year for the next 10 years and no meaningful progress ever gets made?
So in the Netherlands, we have it already, and we have for years and years and years. So this, for us, it's nothing new. It's just, can they propagate it to the rest of the union states? And then that becomes a little bit of a question of, again, the return to the unified data market. Is that going to be allowed by certain nation states? And is everybody going to get on board with that? Technologically speaking, there's not really any reason why it can't happen. I think your issues are going to come on the legislative end.
I think next year it may be ambitious to think about rolling it out, but it comes back to how much you're willing to invest, and also where maybe what part of the world you're doing it in, where it like you said, in the EU there are regulations, but depending on what part of the world this investment is being made, I don't know how fast or how slow or what progress will be. But I don't think, as Christian, I don't think it's going to be still talked about in 10 years. I do feel there probably will be some aggressive investment in trying to figure this out. But yeah, I don't know what next year is going to look like in that.
And I think part of the interest is, what's backing that up, and why is it so important that people are able to do that? One is pensions. The other, though, significantly, is money laundering. So one of the reasons that they want to be able to propagate this between countries, and particularly for financial institutions, really boils down to they're concerned about money laundering. This is one way where they can kind of make sure that they have a little bit more control over people and their general identity, because once you have one set up, then they can obviously use that for better or for worse. There are two edges to this sword. You can always use it against it.
The other driver would be, there are, I suppose, investments in tech cities, and these cities are trying to use as if you're building a city from the ground up, it's meant to be kind of tech city. That's an opportunity to try and introduce a lot of these concepts, including digital identity or digital wallet. So hence why I think we may see the source of that investment coming through as an incentive or driver as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. I mean, and it brings up an interesting topic about what we think, 24 brings in terms of different countries' approach to winning and I won't say the word I was going to winning the race to be the best in technology, right? And I don't mean that from a core technology in terms of semiconductors or whatever, but I mean, if you think about, and I'll read into what you're saying there, Adil. Let me suspect you're talking about something like NEOM, for example, right, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That is a brand new, city being built with a technology first focus. So we're not like we've done in the UK.
7 cities, right? 7 cities. That's the thing, right?
Like we've done in Europe and the rest of the world. We've built physical entities over hundreds, if not thousands, and hundreds of thousands of years, and then we've added technology to it. This thing is completely different, right? I mean, it's a technology first. I wonder how much we're going to see organizations looking at some of those new, let me call them sort of the new trailblazers, and then trying to think like they do. There's a philosophy I had that I learned off my former CIO years ago, where he said, if you're thinking big, you should always start out here and then work backwards. He said, because if you start here and go like this, you'll never get to there, right? And so he used to encourage us to think like really broadly. And so I wonder if in 24, folks who are in CTO roles and chief transformation officer roles and chief information officer roles, I wonder if they're looking at some of these other, companies and entities and communities out there who are doing things very differently and thinking, well, why can't we do that? Why should we not go, kind of create these moonshots and sort of work backwards? Or do you think we're still seeing this, kind of legacy of, well, we're going to move to cloud in really small incremental steps because, we can't think big enough to say, you know what, just throw all this stuff away because all the money that we spend, we can do something better with it over here.
Well, it's about ambition, right? And I believe, Saudi Arabia and the investments that they're making, a lot of people say Riyadh is the next Dubai or the better Dubai. And so if their ambition is there and you're creating a city, like you said, from the ground up, you have a greenfield opportunity to absolutely create, define an entire society and digital society, an opportunity to, like you say, trailblaze, not just in technology, but leveraging technology to define what a model society looks like. So that will definitely be a driver.
One of the things I've been reading a lot lately is the EU is in a very precarious economic situation, in that there's been growth and inflation has slowed, but there's a very fine tipping point right now in terms of what is the economy capable of doing and how can that grow. And I think that becoming a little bit more digital centric and making these moonshots and really starting to try to grow a little bit more of this technology, particularly focusing on the EU and that economic area, could potentially be a really good way to stimulate the economy and continue to maintain a relevant economy for the rest of the world. Because again, if it keeps contracting, that becomes a little bit more difficult and we start losing some of our footing, and then, there's snowball effects attached to that as well.
So I'm going to ask one more I'll introduce one more topic, which I think we all have an opinion on. And then as we wrap up, I'm going to ask you for your big prediction for 24. So let's kind of try and do what we always do and balance both sides here. So, we've talked about Gen AI, we've talked about different technologies, we've talked about the rate and the speed of technology. And yet, it's easy to forget that in large companies and the ones that we deal with every day, it's still a people game, right? So there are so many people that we interact with so many different sets of skills. When you think about the technology landscape and you think about the evolution of the things that we've talked about, and there's there's 100,000 million new Amazon cloud services announced at reInvent, right? So now you have to figure out whether they're relevant. And, then there's a Gartner hype cycle with a bunch of things you've never heard about. So you need to go and figure out whether they're relevant. There's Gen AI that we've talked about with a completely different skill set that we're used to. So we have to go and try and figure out what that's all about. All while trying to, keep the lights on in what we've already got, but trying to make that progress we talked about in whatever way, whether that's moonshot or whether it's the incremental or whatever. And then we realize, wow, we're asking these people to learn more and more and more, and to become more productive and more effective, and more conversant with the technologies whilst delivering for the business, and all while saying, well, we've not got the right skills. We've got 2 million jobs in the US alone on cybersecurity that are unfulfilled. We haven't got the right skills. We don't know how to get people up to speed. We don't know what advice would you give for senior folks looking at 24 and trying to figure out, okay, so if I put a strategy together, how on earth am I going to staff this? Where am I going to get the right skills and the right people who are a cultural fit? How do I approach that? I mean, my view is that we should be looking more and more to automation as much as we can, right? Just like we saw in automotive manufacturing 100 years ago, right? It becomes more efficient, and it's not about displacing jobs. It's about, in my opinion, value creation, and where that value creation leads to creating new jobs that we don't even know exist yet, right? Because, think about it, a year ago, would any of us know what a prompt engineer was? I certainly wouldn't, so now I do, right? As a result of what's happened in Gen AI. What simple piece of advice would you give for folks who are trying to figure out how to navigate through the skills gap for 24?
Yeah, I think it's time to start focusing more on people, and stop thinking that that person who has the computer science background, who's done everything and jumped up the ropes from junior, meteor, senior, and is now in that management position. It's time to start flipping that on its head and leveraging your people, and understanding that just like you come up with a technology strategy to automate, and you say, I want to automate this, and these are the flows that I want to find, you need to do that with your people as well. And that means diversifying who you're bringing into your teams. I had a brilliant team once that I built out. It was a pedagogue, an architect, like an actual building architect, an autodidact, myself, who comes from a very non-traditional background. What we were able to achieve was incredible. And we did it in a way that we were able to educate then the rest of the team and make sure that we were building out the capabilities. So when we came in, it was a very siloed approach. Each person had their specialty. By the time we left, we were all more or less on the same level. And the productivity in that team was just absolutely unreal. So making sure that you're leveraging people so that you have that support within your teams, and they're giving you more than this is what I was signed up to do, and they kind of challenge each other to do that.
I think the skill shortage challenge is evergreen, especially every year there's the next new trend, and everyone is then investing time to learn that next new technology or the next new thing. That will always be evergreen. And to your point, Christian, organizations probably get overwhelmed with, there's so many different things now we need to learn, and so many different skills that need to be trained up. That should really further emphasize around focusing on abstraction, focusing on more managed services. And if we take that principle of shared responsibility model that the cloud service providers have proliferated, applying that same principle internally in the organizations, coming back to your point around automation, but using automation to create the right abstraction, therefore that cognitive load, reducing the cognitive load and reducing the scope of skills that needed to be acquired, I think is a start.
Okay, well, it's almost time for us to wrap up here, but I'm gonna ask you for one big prediction that is 24 that could be, let's be honest, may not happen in 24, but something to give everybody something to think about. I'm gonna give you an observation, and then I'm gonna give you a prediction, and the likelihood of the prediction happening is pretty low, but let me give you the reason. So for About 30 years I've been involved with technology in one way or another, and throughout all of that 30 years, humans, one way or another, through every programming language, every stack, have had to understand the language of the computer, right? So, when you started off with Pascal, like I did, in Fortran, and then went into all sorts of other crap, I now think that we're at the inflection point where computers finally understand the language of the human. So between now and the end of 2024, I'm going to predict that you are going to be able to, in natural language, describe your application exactly how you want it to look, exactly what you want it to do, exactly which cloud you want it to be provided on, and exactly how much you want to spend on it. And it's going to go and do it in the background for you. So you can think about that as the next generation of citizen development, low code, no code, whatever it is. I think for relatively simple apps between now and the end of 2024, you will not need to know a single piece of code or a single piece of infrastructure or how it works. That's
when you say so. When you say simple apps, are we talking like 3-tiered apps? Are we talking static web pages with minimal functionality? What's the cutoff for you for simple?
I think it could be, if we think about it, a traditional sort of end-tier app, web tier, middle tier / database layer. I think that's entirely possible by the end of 24.
Sure.
I don't think that's challenging at all. I think, even without the AI application of AI, a lot of that kind of, if you look at Terraform stacks, for example, a lot of that can be applied and then be a single API call away. And so, AI being able to apply that, obviously, it can be a lot wider. How much of that goes into production? I don't know.
I'm talking about creation of all this as well, Adil, not just deployment. I'm talking about something generating the HCL in the case of Terraform.
And we have something like that, right? I think there's features right now, right, where we've. And then there's a. Okay. Yeah, I know there was some kind of release as well with our partnership with Google. I saw yesterday, so I think that's going to play a big part.
So you guys have 30 seconds each for yours.
Oh,
all right, I'll go first. I'll go first. Look, I've mentioned it a few times already. I'm going to bet. I'm going to go at a bit lower level here, but my bet is on that data platform team and the emergence of that data platform team and data as a product. I think that's going to become a lot more wider with greater visibility across enterprises, within enterprises. My bet is that this is where the focus will shift, and a lot of it's because of the maturity of the foundational platform team as well.
All right, so I think mine is twofold. I think we're going to get to a year where people start getting really frustrated about the current setup and not knowing how to kind of look at this. So organizational psychology is going to start playing a much bigger role within any sort of platform or IT team, like it hasn't. It's kind of been on the outskirts before and neglected. But I think that that's going to be a role that's a little bit more integrated. Well, I don't know, psychology ops, let's call it. And then I think moving towards an automation of compliance. So ingesting of all of the different legislations. And to your point, Christian, then maybe layering that on in terms of GRC policy to be able to ensure that your application is in control and up to date with the latest GRC.
Well, guys, sadly, we're out of time, but that's been quite the adventure, talking about 23, 24, some big topics that weren't just pure technology, which I always find extremely helpful for context. And so a big thank you to both of you for sharing your insights. It's been definitely very enlightening from my perspective, and I hope so for all of the attendees. And if you did enjoy today's discussion and you want more insights into cloud and security, you can check out our podcast. The three of us do a regular podcast, which we call HashiCast. It's navigating cloud adoption for C-suites, which you can find on all your favorite podcast channels. And next week, actually, we're dropping a HashiCorp predictions blog, which sort of accompanies the podcast a little bit, that dives even deeper into some of the topics that we touched on today. So you can keep an eye out for that at hashicorp.com/blog. The latest trends and insights and more of our musings as we gaze into 24 and beyond. So, on behalf of the three of us and the entire HashiCorp team, thank you so much. And here's to a bright and tech-filled future. So this is Christian signing off. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Happy
guys.
holidays and a happy new year.